Welcome back to Peacock Alley. This is Gary Eminent with your host Dale Wetzel on the Legislature today. Say, Dale, as we're kind of looking, is this week number 6 we've been at this as we've been broadcasting from Peacock?
I think it's number 7.
Number 7. Mm-hmm. So next Friday, a week from tomorrow, is crossover. And we begin to start shifting to the next phase of this because really the legislative session could go up to May 1st or thereabouts. So this is coming up in the end of February. So the work the intensity starts mounting, doesn't it, with the legislators at least do this crossover, and then they get a little slack, and then it kind of picks up again. Is that?
Well, what happens is when the House finishes its work on its bills and the Senate finishes its work on its bills, they go on a break, and the break starts. It's scheduled to start a week from tomorrow, Friday. That's what's called crossover. And what they do is they take Monday and Tuesday off. They come back Wednesday. And the second half of the legislature is, I mean, the first half is intense, but the second half is much more intense than the first, because when you're voting in the Senate on a House bill, it means that you could be making the final decision on it, because unless the governor vetoes a bill or unless it goes to a House-Senate conference committee, then that bill has a big chance of becoming law if it passes in the Senate after it passes in the House. And so there is a more intense level of scrutiny applied to bills, because you're not putzing around anymore. I mean, once you vote this thing and you vote it out, the governor signs it, it's a law, so you need to make sure that it's in the best shape possible.
When I think of I'm not sure everybody knows that every bill, I mean, every state does this, every bill that goes to committee, whether it's House or Senate, if it gets a do not pass, still ends up on the floor, and a number of them do get overturned, don't they? They end up be getting passed on the floor, where some states don't do that. If it gets killed in committee, it's done, right?
It's still fairly rare for a committee recommendation to be overturned, but you're right. I mean, all of the bills, unless they're withdrawn by the sponsor, which happens, but that's not frequent, all bills get a vote in the House or the Senate. And that's one of I think, the glories of the North Dakota system. I mean, it does take more time. There's no question about that. But committees have very little power in the North Dakota system, because they can't bottle up bills. They can't kill bills. The worst that they can do to a bill is say to the rest of the legislature, you shouldn't pass this bill, it's a bad idea. But the full House or the full Senate is free to ignore that kind of judgment. And on some subjects, they often do. I mean, on most of the bills, committee recommendations carry a great deal of weight, because most of the legislature is not familiar with a particular bill, and they trust their committees to vet bills and make decisions on whether they're wise policy or not. But you do get circumstances, well, such as we had today, where the question is, should we allow the police in North Dakota to pull someone over if they're not wearing their seatbelt? And everyone has an opinion about that. You don't need to listen to a committee debate to have an opinion about whether that's a good idea or not. And so in those circumstances where you're talking about a subject that's fairly well known, committee recommendations carry less weight. But the truth of the matter is, and the strength of the system is that all bills get a vote. I mean, you can have the dumbest bill imaginable,
and there are some,
and even because literally a constituent, this happens often. A constituent approaches a legislator and says, I'm mad about this. I'm mad that the beehives are too close to the road, and I'm driving along the road, and all of a sudden I got bees splattered all over my windshield.
They're hard to get off too.
Oh yeah,
so that's a good one. No, I'm kidding.
Well, your friend and mine, Leighton Freeborg, put in bills like that.
Really?
Yes, he did, because he get a constituent who said, geez, I don't like these bee carcasses all over my windshield, and so why don't you have a bill to put the beehives further away from the road? And then it happens. He goes to the Legislative Council, they draft a bill, he introduces it, and it gets a hearing in the Senate, and it gets a vote on the floor, and it gets a debate. And, and this is the result, on some occasions, of a single constituent, or maybe one or two, going to a legislator and saying, this annoys me, or I think that there ought to be a law about this. And that legislator says, okay, and you draft up a law.
Absolutely.
And, there's one example that I can think of that really, annoyed me as a member of the press, is a fellow went to a legislator because he was mad that his email address was listed on some record. And so now, email addresses can be redacted. There's a bill introduced, and the legislature said, "Oh, that sounds like a good idea," which I didn't think it was, but that was not my decision to make. And now we can redact email addresses or black them out when you get public records. And
wow.
And things do happen that way.
Well, as we kind of talk about crossover, a couple things on the political note, we have Republicans and Democrats, of course, and in the Republican side, being a former Republican chairman, I know at crossover, Republicans just reorganize, through May 15th, where all the districts got to come up with new district chairman to get reorganized and elect a new state chairman in June. The Democrats, I understand, have totally reorganized their districts, and then they're electing a new state chairman this coming weekend. Now, why I bring that up is that a lot of the legislators and a lot of the districts you'll see around the state now, they have a lot of their Lincoln Day dinners. Now, the Democrats don't honor the Lincoln Day dinners, but Republicans do. So you'll see a lot of Lincoln Day dinners around the state in Republican circles, and you'll see the districts reorganizing. So some of the listeners across the state will be seeing if they happen to be of the Republican persuasion, will be having Lincoln Day dinners, district reorganization. That occurs really, I would bet half of them occur over this next crossover weekend. So it's kind of a little political insight as far as kind of the organizational stuff. So
yeah, but the break goes Monday and Tuesday, and people come back Wednesday. It used to be, and when I just remember when John Dorso, who was a Republican from Fargo, when he was the majority leader, what you needed to find out was when he had his plane ticket to go somewhere, and then you could count on at least the House. You could count on the House making crossover, by that time. You could pretty much write that in blood. And I don't know what the current majority leader, Al Carlson from Fargo, I don't know if he has vacation plans. Maybe he doesn't. But I do know that John Dorso used to take off and go somewhere, and you needed to know when he had his ticket, when he was leaving, and then you could make your plans accordingly.
Now, Dale, this hour is sponsored by the North Dakota soybean growers, and as we just kind of think of this next hour, and I recall, Scott, when you were here just about a month ago, we had a couple young farmers that are growing soybeans, and it was a very interesting discussion. I had a lot to learn. I mean, I didn't know that much about soybeans, even though I got a brother-in-law that's raised some of them. So.
Gary's talking to Scott Rising, who's the legislative director of the North Dakota Soybean Growers Association. Hello, Scott.
Hi.
Why don't we let you get in a word in edgewise here?
Well, interesting you'd say that, because I'm not a soybean grower myself. But on Tuesday we had the Soybean Expo in Fargo, and of course they always bring in speakers for that. And I thought one of the really kind of interesting parts of that activity is in the morning we had economist number 1, and in the afternoon we had economist number 2. Huh. And they were just about as far apart as you could get between Democrat and Republican. Huh. One was going to roll the world in gold dust, and the other one said, "Oh, wait a minute." So who knows?
So what's your consensus, Scott? Do you feel that we're going in a good direction? Do you think it's going to turn around, or when you compare what the two had to say, how did you weigh those two?
Well, in the classic economy, or what an economist would tell you, that we have a strong belief that the supply doesn't stretch quite as far as the demand, so we're hoping prices stay up. And the other gentleman suggested that, well, you might want to look a little harder at supply. So we'll see what happens. But the first thing we need in North Dakota is a little bit of rain. Not necessarily right now, but certainly in April and May.
So what? You mentioned this conference. Well, what was said that you thought was interesting?
Well, the basic idea of I think what part of the message there is that in the times of plenty, it's time to prepare for what we know the market's going to do. At some point, it's going to make a downturn. How sharp or how long that lasts, we're not sure. But part of the message is be cash smart and make sure you got the reserves to weather what's obviously going to happen. Commodity prices go up and life is good, and commodity prices go down. And among the other things, we're at the legislature trying to figure out a way to survive it. So overall, I think the activity and the ag economy in the state is very positive. I think we can look for that to continue, certainly in the short term. But again, it depends on Mother Nature and what she brings to the table as well as anything we do.
You mentioned you're a meeting of the Ag Coalition. What was talked about? First of all, can you explain to us what is the Ag Coalition?
Well, the Ag Coalition is a assembled group of about 40 or 45 entities that have an interest in agriculture. Things such as soybean growers, corn growers, grain growers, wheat commission, soybean council, and a host of other folks that have a direct impact on agriculture. And we meet during the legislative session every 2 weeks to talk a little bit about what's going on in our part of it, or what a status of a bill might be. And one of the key things that the Ag Coalition does for us is they will, by majority consent, 75% perhaps endorse a piece of legislation. The other thing the Ag Coalition does that we did this afternoon is we elect people to the State Board of Research and Education, which is a core function for the Ag Coalition.
And what is the State Board of Research and Education?
Those folks gather, take input much as during interim periods of the legislature, and take input across the agriculture community as to what our research rented tongue.
Oh, that's okay.
Research priorities might be, and the Extension Service priorities as they relate to the farmers and ranchers across the state. They put a great deal of time and effort into it, and ultimately recommend a budget to the Board of Higher Education, and that is passed on to the Office of Management and Budget for the Governor, and then on to the appropriation committees for funding. And what we did today was we elected one of those folks out of the Ag Coalition to represent us on that SBARE, that priority setting board for agriculture. The good news is that we had 5 outstanding candidates. It was a very competitive field, a very competitive election. We had Mr. Lyle Warner from the North Dakota Lamb and Wool Producers Association, who has a long history of involvement both from that industry and teaching at BSC in the Ag department.
So he's the gentleman who won?
Absolutely.
All right.
Great guy. We had candidates from the Stockmen's Association, the Wheat Commission, as well as the corn growers, and all very, very talented folks.
How well do the soybean growers make out in the compilation of research priorities that the State Board of Research and Agricultural Research and Education does?
It depends on the year, obviously. But a big share of capital kinds of projects that have been recommended over the last 3 or 4 years have involved, for example, the new greenhouse at NDSU that is critical to much of the ag research that goes on here. The pieces that all fit into that puzzle, we've been reasonably successful, but it comes on a priority basis, and sometimes, unless there's some kind of crisis, it's really kind of wait your turn until funding's available.
What are the research priorities of the soybean growers?
Well, this year we were fortunate that it looks like if everything goes like it looks like it might happen with Senate Bill 2020, we are going to get what's called a nematologist to help us out with a soybean root disease that severely impacts yields. They're little worm critters that live in the ground, and they're there all the time. But under certain conditions, particularly wetter conditions, they manifest themselves in a way that are harmful to us. They're common in soybean acreage all across the country, whether it's here or other places. But because soybeans are relatively new here, they have multiplied to where they've threatened us like they do now.
Is this a subject of genetic research?
I don't know that I can answer that.
What I was thinking of was there was research done on corn.
Yeah, that's. I was just going to mention that. That's exactly right.
Essentially, you have a genetic variety of corn seed that grows a type of corn that kills a pest.
That's resistant to it. There is. I'm certain there's research work going on in that arena, but to date, that hasn't manifested itself in a big way. So.
When it comes to soybeans compared to corn, or when you kind of take the numbers of obviously corn's gone to the roof because of ethanol lately, but Scott, how is soybean growing? I mean, as far as the ratio, as far as the numbers, the tonnage, or how you measure that, what's happened in the last 5 years in yields and growth in that rate?
The soybean acres have skyrocketed. We were up over about 4.2 or 4.3 million acres this year. We harvested, and I forget the exact bushel number, but a record crop. The direct sales to the farmer were somewhere just north of $2 billion, which multiplies itself in the economy in North Dakota, of course. But I'm not particularly well versed in the soybean, the nuances of that whole process.
But there's more people growing soybeans, and there are more soybean acres being planted.
Absolutely, and we're expecting that to continue to expand. It's been a profitable crop based on soil preparation kinds of activities. The input costs are a little bit lower than, say, corn, for example, and it's proved very successful. We have varieties here in the state. I think our average last year was somewhere between 33 and 34 bushels to the acre, which is pretty significant stuff.
What are the market risks that soybean growers face these days? I mean, we mentioned that prices are good right now, but what is there out on the horizon that might change that? The unique threat that you see in the soybean community is something where we compete with South America, and of course it is their fall harvest time, or close to it right now. So what used to be kind of a central U.S. market kind of capability on a once-a-year thing. If I'm in the world, somewhere out in the world, say China, for example, and I'm buying soybeans, I have two opportunities during the year. And I can buy them from South America one part of the year, and the other part of the year I can buy them from the U.S. Fortunately, we in the U.S. grow very good quality soybean. As the middle income in those Asian countries in particular, where we market well over 90% of the beans from North Dakota, as their middle income group grows and their demand for food changes more toward not only just edible soybean products, but soybean as a feed meal for chickens and pigs, or poultry and hog kind of industry. Our market improves here. We really see no soybean processing in the state of North Dakota, primarily because we are West Coast soybeans. Nobody west of us grows them toward a western kind of market. The other part is that the South American market is very competitive in the meal side of things, because they do some protectionist kinds of things to keep the employment within their own groups. So the soybeans that are exported, what is it that the customers for those soybeans, what do they use them for? Do they feed them to animals? Do they eat them? What do they do with them?
Well, they do both. And in North Dakota, we're very fortunate in the fact that we have a part of our soybean industry that is what's called non-genetically modified, non-GMO, that provides food-grade soybeans. And I can't tell you exact bushels on it, but they've been very successful with it. They have a market that I don't believe that they can meet. They have a demand out there that's incredible and growing, and that's generally the food grade group. But
these are sold to whom?
China, Japan, Vietnam, in Indonesia. There's a pretty good market for them.
And what do they what products do they make from the soybeans?
Oh, I think they use them for just about everything, but what we would probably be most familiar with would be something like tofu as a protein replacement.
I was thinking about there's a shop just south of here that sells kind of non-dairy soybean. It looks like soft serve ice cream, but it isn't, and it looks like a fairly promising market for soybeans, food-grade soybeans.
I have to go and look for that.
I didn't even realize that was what it was until I went in there and started reading the literature.
When you say south, you mean it like in the shopping center?
It's just south here on 3rd Street.
Yeah, okay.
Well, there's some future, not only for the soybean necessarily, but almost all of these commodities that we produce, in the fact that the chemical engineers have figured out ways to break these down into molecules and reassemble them and that sort of thing. And we look for those kinds of opportunities to improve. So
we are speaking to Scott Rising. He's the legislative director for the North Dakota Soybean Growers Association. The North Dakota Soybean Growers Association is the sponsor of the second hour tonight of the Legislature Today radio show. We're coming to you live from the Peacock Alley American Grill and Bar in downtown Bismarck, and it is political wing night. You can buy naked wings or you can buy breaded wings, and they're both quite tasty, I can assure you. So if you're driving around downtown Bismarck and have a hankering for some chicken wings, this is an excellent place to get them. Once again, this is the Legislature Today radio show. I'm your host, Dale Wetzel. We will be back in a moment.
Welcome back to Peacock Alley. This is Gary Emineth with your host, Dale Wetzel. We're broadcasting live from Peacock Alley, which has a great, rich tradition of politics as we talk about the legislature today. The Peacock Alley is in the Patterson building, where there's been 4 U.S. presidents have visited: Coolidge, LBJ, JFK, and Teddy Roosevelt. 2 Republicans, 2 Democrats. Tonight's left wings, right wings. So we've had, a split with party. I don't know if our wings would be a split, what people order here, but this is a great tradition.
I guarantee you, though, that Calvin Coolidge probably said the least of any of those 4 gentlemen.
I got a little show I do with my wife called Table Talk, Dale, and we talked about Calvin Coolidge today. In fact, it was kind of interesting because we've been talking about a book called The Forgotten Man, talking about, and it's a great book.
It is a great book.
It has to deal with, for those listeners out there, with the Depression and the transition from Hoover and FDR, and we've been talking about it every week, my wife and I. She's the reader. She's doing a book review on it, and it's been interesting just kind of dealing with what led up to the Depression and kind of the different perspectives. But the point of Coolidge was he was really Reagan's favorite, Ronald Reagan, who was my favorite president, who Coolidge was his guy. But he was not the communicator that Ronald Reagan was, but a lot of the same philosophy when it came to...
Well, he didn't have to be. He didn't have television.
Yeah, that's good point. Good point. Yeah, point taken. There's a history man himself. He knows what's going on. So this hour, this is sponsored by the North Dakota Soybean Growers Association, and we have Scott Rising, who's the legislative director, here with us, and we've been talking a little bit about soybeans and their conference that was earlier Tuesday in Fargo. And Dale, I'll turn it over, and we'll talk a little bit what happened in the legislature today and issues that impact the soybean agriculture tonight is kind of on the...
Mr. Rising, I understand that the Senate Appropriations Committee has been dealing with the Department of Transportation budget, which soybean growers have an interest in because obviously it has a lot of money for roads. Could you talk about that for a moment?
Yes, this morning the DOT budget was passed out of the Senate. Appropriations Committee and sent to the Senate floor. It incorporated some additive things that we were advocating for dealing with bridges. There's about another $27 million in there for bridges. It appears as though when we study roads, we don't always look at the bridges that hold the roads up. So it was something that we view as very positive. More importantly, I think that whole DOT transportation bill, between that and the one that the governor put out early, dealing with infrastructure funding, particularly the state highway system in the west and the rural road issues in the non-oil producing counties. Between these two bills, I think for the first time in a very long time, if ever, we really are fully funding rural road reconstruction in the state of North Dakota, and I think that's an important point to make, the reconstructive part of it. We really are in a mode where some roads will be fixed for a while, but we really are in a mode where we need to reconstruct the roads. They were never designed to handle the kind of activity that we currently put on them, primarily due to increasing size and weight, just total volume of what we harvest these days with corn and soybeans.
You mentioned this a bit, but could you explain a bit more the significance of road reconstruction here and how it differs from road repair? Basically you're talking about the need to make a road broader and tougher because it's carrying heavy traffic and more of it?
Oh, exactly that. But the truth of the matter is in order to carry the full weight of, say, 80,000-pound trucks, or to reconstruct roads to 110,000-pound capability, what we need to do is rebuild the road. You really have to start over. Our grandfathers scraped up out of the ditches, what we call ditches, the road materials, and they were never designed to haul the kinds of capacity and the weight that we currently put on the roads. What we discovered last year, toward the end of the year, when it's dry, of course, or what we've known for a long time, when it's frozen, the roads work just fine. But if you get a little bit of moisture on them or any reason for them to soften up a little bit, we have some real problems.
Dale, got a question, Scott, when you're talking about this, the dollars in the budget related to the roads reconstruction. We always talk, when you talk about heavy loads out west, we all know what that means, water, oil, etc., sand. But when you talk about farmers, I think of my brother-in-law that he's got a semi now. His grandfather never had semis. They had grain trucks that didn't have these loads. And so obviously, as we've had great yields, etc., when it comes down to that whole process, what kind of dollars are being spent on the roads? This is just a question for the listeners out there related to that are non-oil patch. Is it a 20% going to go outside of it? And then one of the other questions is, normally we get all this 90% federal funding, Dale, or comes out of that. Is that what, I don't know what the federal is for the highway department budget, or how does that play back into North Dakota spending more money? Are we still getting our federal dollars, or are we paying a heavier percentage because we have it?
We're paying a heavier percentage because we have it. There is a federal match, that's what it's called, for North Dakota transportation budget. And it's raised primarily by the fuel tax and motor vehicle registration. But the demand for road repairs in North Dakota, for road reconstruction, for bridge reconstruction, for repairs and just general road maintenance, it greatly outstrips what the federal government would normally provide to the state of North Dakota. And so we're having to throw in a bunch more state money. That's why spending on roads has increased so dramatically over the last 4 years. It isn't because the federal government is throwing in more money.
Yeah, that's what I wondered.
It's because the state government has decided, well, our needs are so great, and the task at hand is so large that you can't rely just on federal highway matching funds. You have to put in state general funds, which, from income and sales taxes. It used to be that road repair money state road repair money came almost exclusively from motor vehicle registration and fuel tax. Well, there isn't enough of that, not nearly enough of that, to meet what needs to be done, to pay for what needs to be done. And there isn't nearly enough federal money, even if we get as much as we're entitled to do what needs to be done. So there has been a decision to invest a lot of this oil money primarily into road construction, because if all you did was relied upon state motor fuels taxes, which is the traditional way of doing it, and federal funds, you wouldn't begin to approach to accomplish the job that needs to be done.
I think and I've only been in this legislative business for about 2.5 sessions. And my understanding is that as far as the federal money goes, the state has always built the funding around, up until last biennium, built the funding that was put into our infrastructure around the idea that we simply have to maintain what we have at the local level, and then match federal money for our state highways. Well, as Dale suggested, that's not nearly enough to do the infrastructure work that we really need to do to rebuild our grandfathers' infrastructure. One of the real advantages that we have in this country, going back to the soybean business, for example, is Brazil, one of our key competitors in the soybean world, is they can grow great soybeans, and they can do it relatively inexpensive, but they simply do not have the transportation infrastructure to get their soybeans 600 miles to market in an effective way. So it allows us to be competitive on a world market, and that's one of the real pluses here. And of course, when President Eisenhower implemented the interstate highway system, it was for much of that same purpose. He realized that based on his experience in World War II and the Autobahn and that sort of thing, what a treasure that would be. And it may have been sold under the need for military purposes in this country, but the reality is it's served us very well. And so we're about rebuilding not necessarily just the interstates, but certainly all of the things that connect to it. We had prior to the last session in 2011, the oil-producing counties all got together and had the Upper Great Plains Transportation Institute generate a study dealing with oil-impacted roads, which gave us some kind of picture on what it took out there. There were a number of us from the ag community and others, the Association of Counties, the townships, and so forth, that put some money in a pot and commissioned a study to look at all of the non-oil impacted roads across the state. And then in the last session, the legislature thought it wise to continue that. And we have a new study that shows us across the state for non-state highways and non-federal roads, basically, the rural roads in this state, we need about $800 million. And the basic ratio of that breakout is 5, if you took $8, 5 of those $8 should go to the west, and 3 of those $8 should go to the non-oil impacted roads. And it looks like the legislature is going to fund that. We're excited about that. But as Dale suggested, the traditional method that we use to fund roads simply will not fund the rebuilding of those roads that are so critical, certainly to our ag economy, which is the biggest member of the economy in the state of North Dakota.
Well, if you take I think what's happened in the state, whether it's ag or oil, which has both been big, to reinvest that back. I mean, that helps all people. It helps all segments of the industry and people. Sometimes we build buildings and monuments, and those are they don't help because you got to fill them back up. But roads, we all drive across. I drive a lot of them up into Devil's Lake and in and out of Fargo. I just came from Grand Forks and Fargo and Devil's Lake today, and you get on Highway 3 and Highway 19, and you get on these east-west, which are not interstates or the 4 lanes, and you say some of them need some work, and it's great that we're investing some of that back because it's going to last us a long time when we do that. So that's great that the governor and the legislators are providing leadership in that area.
And of course, what we could do 2 years ago for $10 is now costing us $11.50 or $12, or in some cases more, depending upon the access to something that is simple as gravel or that aggregate necessary to do this. So
Anything else that the legislature has done recently that is of particular interest to the soybean growers?
To us or for us?
Both.
Yeah, to you it has to do with raising taxes. For you is helping you make the bill, pay the bills. Is that 2 and 4? Scott. That is very clever on your part. 2 and 4.
I'm kind of waiting for something to shake out that's definitive in the area of property tax relief.
I was going to ask you about that, actually. Yeah.
We spent,
what approach do you prefer? Do you think that it's the best to exempt a certain value of property from tax, or to continue to subsidize the local school districts?
I have some mixed emotion on that. We absolutely, I think, there's some positive aspects to funding the education part of it through the school districts that are horribly important. But as far as the basic property tax relief, I think it needs to have some elements in it, and one of them needs to be that we all pay something. I don't think we can let anybody out of this box without paying something. I can speak from my own personal standpoint. If I don't really have any money in the poker game, I'm not too concerned about what kind of cards I get dealt. And that's the way I look at it. So if we all play in some format, and we certainly do, I think that's workable. But I think people are expecting what I'm going to call significant property tax relief that's readily visible. And where I see us right now in the legislative process is that we've come down pretty hard in favor of income tax relief for individuals, and I don't hear very many people asking for that. We've come down pretty hard with corporate tax relief, and I don't hear a lot of people asking for that. There's some significant change going on in the financial institution tax process that I think is probably worthy of our attention and supportable. We're taking a serious look at reducing long-term oil and gas tax, which I think is worthy of attention. And I think the thing that people are really asking for, the property tax relief, is a whole lot less developed at this point in the legislative session. I think there's a number of people real concerned about that, and I'm not sure how it's going to wash out. But I am concerned, and we think that we would be best served if there was money that flowed, for example, directly to the counties and brought direct relief that's easily visible. But having said that, the $800 million we're going to put into rural infrastructure, I think, is a big piece of property tax relief long term. But the reality is the road's not going to be fixed for a couple of years. By the time the road is fixed and we see the impact a couple of years down the road after that on potentially what the tax impact might wash out to be for local entities, that's going to be a little bit harder to discern, and people maybe won't be quite so patient to wait for that.
It's an interesting schism in a number of ways, and one of the things that's going on, frankly, is that there is quite a bit of emphasis about developing plans to cut corporate and individual income tax, and there certainly is a lot of debate about whether or not anyone gives a rip about whether they have their individual income tax cut, or if you're a large corporation, if you have your corporate tax cut. And this is one of the political implications of the session for the next campaign, because the Democratic caucus has staked out the position that people don't care about income taxes, they care about property taxes. And right now, it's uncertain what approach the legislature is going to take to reduce property taxes, or at least relieve the pressure on rising property taxes. And it's a much more developed plan at this point as to how income taxes are going to be cut. And the Democratic minority in the legislature is arguing, and is going to continue to argue, that that's exactly backwards, that property taxes should be the emphasis here, not income tax, whether corporate or individual. And it'll be interesting to see if there is, frankly, political consequences to be had if the Republican caucus doesn't come up with the sort of property tax relief plan that people can discern in terms of it's being beneficial to them. And if you're going to take the governor's plans for reducing income tax, which really are quite modest, and double down on those and neglect, in a comparative sense, the urgency for property tax relief, then it'll be interesting to see if there is any sort, how it all washes out in the end. That's the first thing. And the second thing is, if there isn't the sort of property tax relief that people can grasp, are they going to say, well, this whole property tax thing, what was going on? Instead these guys were cutting my income tax, and I don't care about that.
Well, I think you make a very valid point from the standpoint of clarity. A year ago, we were traveling around the state trying to turn back the idea of Measure 2 that eliminated property tax. And I found in many communities where I had an opportunity to speak and in many groups, when I suggested to them that we were already enjoying $385 million worth of property tax relief, that was news to several people. I mean, to lots of people. And I think it is incredibly important that whatever we end up with in this legislative session, it be crystal clear to the average person that this is property tax relief and it has this value to me.
Well, part of the problem, Scott, though, is when it came down to it is there might have been, they might have done the property tax relief, but if they still overspent or spent more, some people's taxes actually went up, and so they didn't get that. They all expected to get this money back, and it was so if I paid $3,000 last year, it's going to be $2,500, or they had a number in their head, and I paid $3,000. I look at last year, I'd say, well, I'm paying $3,200. Well, where was that 30? So I guess they tried to deal with that when it came down. We talked about that before. That's the challenge of where do you do it, and when the legislature starts meddling with property tax, which is what bothers a lot of people, it's really not their constitutional responsibility for some of us to say they shouldn't be there, but when they're spending it goes back and forth, it's tied back to education.
See, the thing is, too, is that the way folks would realize what the legislature has been doing to relieve the property tax burden is if they all of a sudden yanked the rug out, said, okay, I'm sorry, school districts, you're not going to have $350 million over 2 years. Then that would go right on people's property tax bill, and then there would be hell to pay. And then people would realize, oh, that was what they were doing.
Exactly.
And it's complicated, though, so a lot of people don't get that because they expect, well, it's up to $1,000, so people are going, I paid $3,000, well, I'm going to get now, I'm going to pay $2,000. Well, notice 10% of this if you hit this, and so the average person doesn't pay attention. Unfortunately, that's the citizens in this country. We're more worried about who won the football game Saturday or basketball game.
I'll come to. I think it's also a matter of, people look at the bottom line. They don't care about the method; they care about the result.
Exactly.
That's right.
And if their property tax bill in 2013 is larger than it was in 2012, or if it's even similar, it's only natural and logical to say these people are talking about property tax relief. Well, where's mine?
Yeah, absolutely.
Well, potentially several bills that are in the process right now include a requirement that you be provided a statement that actually shows in dollars and cents. There's been some bills introduced that try and change this mystical mill into just dollars and cents for the figuring part of it. The conversion of that whole process seems to be something like we might have had with the metric system, and most of us are thinking, maybe not.
I think you're right, Scott.
but I don't know. I sat down and have looked at several of these plans in my own perspective living here in Bismarck, and if you take the 308 mills in Bismarck and you subtract the 60 mills in the governor's plan, well, that doesn't look too bad. But I also know coming right behind me, we're going to build some schools in Bismarck. much needed.
And the voters approved those.
I would argue, and the voters understand that. But I think for lots of folks, when I voted last year and I got the tax bill 18 months later, that connection probably isn't quite so strong. So
yeah,
we
had
run
point
into it all the
taken.
time.
And I do also believe that it also comes down to the fact that you get your property tax statement, and there it is, and you write a check for it, unless you're still paying off your home mortgage and the bank is holding it out. Whereas your income tax, it's withheld.
Yeah.
You're no problem. I mean, as long as you withhold enough, you don't notice it. But, I just remember the first time I got a property tax statement, and I thought, holy cow, how am I going to pay this?
Yeah.
Now, I didn't realize, it didn't occur to me at the time that, I had a mortgage and the bank was withholding, $300. I was paying property tax as part of my monthly mortgage check, and it took, maybe 5 seconds for me to kick in. But it is quite a stunning thing to get that size of a bill in the mail, and with the implication that, got to pay this, pal. And
I don't know about yours, but mine comes right after Christmas time.
Yes, it does.
It comes between getting the gift and getting the credit card bill that says, hello.
Yes,
well, and you get some of these cities. I mean, in Bismarck, his property taxes aren't cheap. Or you get Bismarck Mandan over there, where they've had some of these subdivisions where and you start looking at those assessments, and they don't sometimes people get confused with the special assessments. I mean, most people figure it out, but you buy a place and you don't realize there's $8,000 with special assessments and taxes, and it can get pretty ugly. So,
but when you were talking, what I was thinking is nobody's introduced a bill for property tax out of the paycheck like we do with taxes.
We have the gentleman you just heard is Scott Rising. He's the legislative director for the North Dakota Soybean Growers Association, which is the sponsor of the Legislature Today's second hour tonight. We have with us also Gary Emineth, my co-host, and my name is Dale Wetzel. I'm the host of the Legislature Today. We will see you tomorrow night.
No, we won't.
No, we
see
won't.
You Monday
night.
Saturday
morning. My God.